everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Today on the show, we have Jasper Degenaars from the Fungi Academy. How are you today?
That was pretty good. Yeah, pretty good today. Just went out for a nice forage here in Georgia, and yeah, doing pretty good. Happy to be on here.
Mm, yeah, absolutely. And you're visiting Georgia for a wedding, and that sounds fun. And how do you find the mushroom scene different, or at least the wild species you're finding when you're on a forage from Guatemala?
You know that there's such a diversity depending on the ecosystem that you're in, right? So like, I think the genera are relatively the same. So ba almost all over the world, you'll find russulas and some form of Buletaceae, and then you almost always find like turkey tails or certain types of oyster mushrooms. But the also psilocybes, since we were on psychedelic today, um, psilocybes kind of grow all over the world where humans like to live. And I actually went unsuccessful hunting for some Oviodo cystidiatas today, which also known as the river teachers, the local East Coast, one of the local East Coast psychedelic species. And we don't have that one in Guatemala or the Netherlands. So it kind of depending on where you are, there's going to be different species, but there's also going to be different potential poisonous lookalikes, which I think is the most treacherous thing.
Exactly. So let's rewind the tape. So it sounds like you just suggested you're from Netherlands originally. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, I'm from the Netherlands originally.
Great. And how did mushrooms catch your attention back then?
So like I think I was always kind of interested in them as a kid, but my parents were what we call mycophobic, afraid of mushrooms, so they didn't really encourage that like initial interest per se. But then, as many as people know, like psilocybin and psilocybin containing mushrooms and now truffles have been legal in the Netherlands since basically the 70s or the 80s. And when I turned 18, some of my friends had like some truffles with them, and at the time I'd already been smoking cannabis, but mainly like my drug of choice at that time was alcohol, and kind of had like a classic, relatively depressive teenage years. I didn't really feel like I fitted in. I was like, yeah, I didn't have many friends, and was I found a lot of trouble loving myself. And after that first like truffle experience, although it was a very low dose, I think nowadays people call it mini dose or a hyper dose, somewhere around like half a gram of dried cubensis, for reference. But I had a great time, and I kind of was like intrigued to explore more. And then I think that same summer, my parents and my brother and sister were out of town, and I had the whole house to myself. And I decided to just buy a whole container from the store and, like have an experience by myself. And I didn't really know what to expect, but, some people on the internet, I think I was really into Arrowhead at the time. I'm pretty sure I was really into Arrowhead at the time.
Yeah.
I I just read you should just like, oh, maybe watch a cool like animated movie. So I watched The Lion King um, while coming up, and a whole 15-gram container of truffles is kind of equivalent to like well over 3 grams of dried cubensis, depending on the strength. Like with natural products, there's always a wide range, but like that's kind of a rough estimate. And kind of so I was watching the Lion King, and it's like a pretty long movie. So by the time you're like halfway through or so, you're fully in the psychedelic experience. And it was kind of in that moment that like Simba is alone in that gorge and all those wildebeest start storming down that I really started to feel it. And then after that, like Simba was with Timon and Pumbaa in the jungle, and that's really when like the introspective effect of the sacred mushrooms started working, because I was reflecting Simba's perspective of my personal life. Like, oh man, I'm spending too much time with Timon and Pumbaa in the jungle. I should live up to my potential. Like, what am I doing? I'm like just hanging out and quote like air quoting here, like wasting my life away. And then like literally you have the scene of like the whole kingdom at the end, like being reborn from the ashes after it was all on fire. And yeah, that was pretty profound. It was pretty profound. And then I remember crying a lot, but crying out of happiness for the first time, at least in my adult life, that I remember. So it was a pretty profound experience. So after that, I was really like into ex like kind of pushing the boundaries and exploring these psychedelic states. And but these containers were really pretty expensive, and I figured it could be like a cheaper way to do it. And then I hung out with a friend who was a little bit older, and he had like a grow kit, like a Schlossby Cubensis grow kit, which you can also just buy in the stores in the Netherlands. And I just did some quick calculation. I was like, oh man, this is way cheaper than buying truffles. And then I started growing them out of grow kits, and then I started figuring out I was straight up buying grain spawn, and then I was on the shroomery and all these other early mushroom fora, and I've like figured out how to just get bigger batches with the spawn I was buying. So that's kind of how my mycophilia started almost 13 years ago now.
How long did it take you to build your first laminar flow hood?
It took a while. It took a while actually. Because after that, like I did the whole like trying to go to university thing, etc., but that didn't work out. And then basically from my early 20s to my 25th, 26th, I was just traveling. And it's really hard to be a practicing mushroom cultivator if you live out of a 60-liter backpack and like every week you're in a new space. So I kind of kept pursuing kind of the theoretical like side of mushroom cultivation. Like I saw you have like Mycelium Running behind you by Paul Stamets. I found that in like a place I was kind of like volunteering in Australia, and I read that fully. And I was mainly interested just in foraging because I was spending a lot of time in the tropics and the subtropics, so you can find a lot of wild Psilocybe cubensis. Like I found my first one in Thailand growing off of elephant dung, and I was like, I know this mushroom. I've grown a bunch of this mushroom. I know exactly what this mushroom is. And then I didn't need to grow them for a couple years when I was in Southeast Asia and Northern Australia because they just grow everywhere there.
That's great. And how did you know you wanted to take it more seriously, like a career, and start moving towards something like Fungi Academy?
So I didn't really fully know that actually. Like my background is in marketing and sales, and when I kind of quit that life, I was thinking never to go back to it. And then while traveling for a quite long time, I was actually a cook slash chef. So because I could do it, like I could work in a restaurant for a couple weeks or a couple months, and then I could make enough money to travel more, right? And then so I was actually on a quite of a quest to get from Seattle all the way to the Amazon without flying or paying for public transport. And then in the mountains of Oaxaca, I heard of the Fungi Academy, and I just heard about Lake Atitlan kind of as a traveler hub, and I wanted to spend some a little bit more time in one place, and that seemed to be the place. And then like at first it was kind of not what I expected it to be. Like the website already looked really great, and at the time they had like 8,000 followers, and I was like, oh my God, 8,000 followers. And but I got there and I was kind of like not exactly what I was expecting. I kind of wanted to go, but long story short, I when I came out of the United States, I smuggled a mushroom chocolate, like a psilocybin mushroom chocolate, with me, and I was couch surfing with these like two Mexican sisters in Mazatlan, just on the Sea of Cortez, and they had a tiny pet pig, and they told me not to put any food on the floor. So I had like a bag of food and I put it somewhere else, but I completely forgot about this mushroom chocolate that was right next to all my bank cards and credit cards. So this pig just chomped through this bag and destroyed all of my credit cards. So in Mexico, I already didn't have like a credit card anymore, and I was PayPaling friends to just give me cash. But then I got to Guatemala and my PayPal got shut down. So I was there like at Fungi Academy in early 2019, I believe, and didn't have I didn't have any cards, didn't have PayPal, and I kind of was just for like stuck to be there. And then like Oliver, the founder of Fungi Academy, came back a couple weeks later, which was great because now it's like a kind of a mentor and somebody that could share some of his wisdom with me. And then uh, kind of what happened pretty fast is like he asked me to start teaching, and then he asked me to become a manager, and then kind of when we really thought our first full-on like week-long cultivation course, that's kind of also like a mushroom cultivation retreat style. That's really when it clicked. It's like, oh, I could do this for a living. I could do this professionally. I'm basically already doing that right now. So he really like showed me that path of possibility, that sharing knowledge and sharing the tools of mushroom cultivation and just mycology in general can be a sustaining career path.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I came close to starting a few mushroom grows in Colorado, mostly gourmet, and medicinal, and yeah, I I took it seriously enough that that was definitely an option for me. Decided to go this direction instead, so I totally have some affinity for that, and it's so fun growing. I just really wish I could do it more. I need a little bit more space in my life, and I can pull that off. I wish I could grow cubensis. I feel a little iffy growing cubensis here, even though I'm in Colorado. But I think, yeah, I just love that people are getting to learn how to do this. Um, can you share a little bit about like what is it maybe about mushroom growing that feels really engaging for you? Is there something special there?
Yeah, okay, so like often we refer to people that like are good with plants to have like green thumbs or something, right? And
Right.
I worked in a lot of farms, and although like with tenacity I'm able to do it, it has never come natural to me. And but I've always liked the idea of growing my own food and my own medicine. And I did really like growing mushrooms. And like when I was growing mushrooms in the Netherlands, although it was kind of like a super low tech, really approachable way, which I kind of recommend people doing in the first place, it was really fast. That really like intrigued me. You can kind of see the mycelium grow, so you get to know an organism on a more fundamental level when you start building this relationship, right? Like you're supporting the organism's growth, and then like they give you the fruit, and that hopefully then supports your growth, but also like the lessons of the cultivation itself can be quite significant. At least they have been for me. Like kind of the approach that one needs to have for cultivation. And and then like with mushroom cultivation specifically, there's this whole other side that you don't necessarily see in like plant cultivation, is you have to kind of be sterile, and then like you have to work with these agar plates, and you can kind of like select for the best growth, and like there's a really direct feedback loop if you're doing something correct or if you're doing something incorrect. And and like with any mastery, like the in the beginning you start seeing lots of improvement and really fast, and that's just like super motivating. And then to have a crop, be it like a crop of lion's mane, a crop of reishi, cordyceps, or cubensis, for example, within basically like 6 weeks, if you do everything correctly, that's just super exciting. Right? Like you don't really see that necessarily with plants. So that just really hit my dopamine receptors in the right way, and like I was able to just like dedicate years of my life to like honing in on this practice and getting better at it and understanding these organisms more. And like it's kind of like riding a bicycle, right? Like you never fully forget it. And I think it's just so worthwhile to spend time learning a skill or a tool set that is like will kind of potentially give you food security, but also if you start like a homestead or something, give you delicious food, like just oyster mushrooms from your waste product, be it like wood chips or hay or straw or whatever you have on the homestead that like is in excess. You can just grow more food from that. And I think it really ties the loop together in like a cultivation permaculture perspective. But then again, by working with these organisms, you understand like their vital part in the these ecosystems. How without them the loop doesn't get completed. Because then like you understand like, oh, my spend over bags, they're like I'm able to like compost them. And if I compost them, I actually notice that my compost is ready to be put in the garden a lot faster just by adding mycelial biomass.
Right. That's super important. Do you ever make analogies on the psychedelic side to that? Like a kind of a composting um, biocycle kind of deal or soil food web concept?
Yeah, of course. Like it's kind of like compost, like let the mushrooms compost like your old self, right? And like a new version of yourself will fruit from that. I think that's really like a nice analogy that like I think many people have kind of gotten to that same conclusion of like, oh wow, there is a part of death right? Like there's a really nice quote. It's like fungi are the masters of death, creators of life, right? And there's such a correlation with the psychedelic experience and death, right? Like we call it an ego death. There's like a rebirth that we call it. And it's funny that like we're also referring to what's happening in the psychedelic scene right now as the psychedelic renaissance, which is also related to rebirthing, right? And like I do think that the dying, the metaphorical death and acceptance of death and understanding that death is part of the process, death of our previous self, of our current self, of whatever it is. I think mushrooms are big teachers of death in general and the importance of death for, the continuation of this consciousness, this planet.
Mm. Yeah. Um, cool. So you had some that interesting early psychedelic experience with the Lion King, and like I assume there's been more
Oh
for you.
yes. Yeah. There's been
Yeah.
tons more. Tons more. Like I think, I'm relatively young, but I'm about to turn 31 next month, but like I've had several hundred pretty significant experiences just because I was in that psychonautical phase. And then, I was in the Netherlands and I had access to the dark web, so I was able to experiment and, of course, found LSD pretty easily, but then also what now is getting a little bit more popular, but the whole 2C family I experimented with a lot, 2CB, 2CI, 2CE mainly. Ketamine is active in the party scene, which is also another classical psychedelic. MDMA, of course. Maybe if you read like Carl Hart's book or are familiar with 6-APB, that was one of my favorites for a while. But actually, for quite a long time, I was just really into the LSD experiences, either for like solo journeys, and I would like kind of do the therapeutic model by myself. I would lay in bed with headphones on and close my eyes, and then somehow the LSD would show me the birth of the universe or some crazy out there shit, that I'm still still part of how I frame reality is from those really big early experiences. And that also was paired with not doing some smart, the most smart stuff, like coming home drunk from the bar at like 2 a.m. and then thinking, oh yeah, I don't have to work tomorrow. I'll just eat some acid right now, and not recommended. But like I think that's part of the explorative phase, right? You make mistakes, you hurt yourself a little bit. I luckily never hurt myself too significantly. Um, but like I was definitely in a full on, let me test kind of all of the boundaries of all the different forms of consciousness. And then kind of later, then the cacti also came into being, which also in the Netherlands you can just buy peyote and buy wachuma, also known as San Pedro, in stores, right? Um,
Wow.
yeah, that's kind of the reality over there. So like tried a little bit, didn't necessarily like it, but then I started like really getting more familiar with kind of like ceremonial settings, and um, I think there's a beauty in that, and I think also with like going back on the mushrooms, right? There's a real beautiful part because there's not like a traditional ceremony. Yes, you can argue that the Mazateks have the traditional ceremony that stayed alive. Um, during the 20th century, but mushrooms are from all over the world. They're also like indigenous to Europe. They're also indigenous to North America, and we can right now find these new ceremonies, invent these new ceremonies for these teachers, kind of being inspired without stealing from indigenous cultures and how they held ceremonies, but also like adding our own flair to it, right? And I've, yeah, we've and some friends have been experimenting with that a lot, and it's really some most profound experiences of my life.
Yeah. So you bring up mushrooms existing all over the world, which is something that I think the movement sometimes maybe forgets or overlooks. Paul Stamets made a really good argument somewhat recently about psilocybin containing species being in Europe for a very long time. Some people like to argue that they were introduced post Columbus. Do you have any kind of perspectives on that, psilocybin containing species in Europe?
Yeah, well, like recently a paper came out that like the genus psilocybe, right? So that's why it's called psilocybin, and like technically psilocybin containing mushrooms is not even correct because psilocybin is not even psychoactive. It needs to be metabolized by your liver into psilocin. Psilocin is the tryptamine that actually attaches to the 5-HT2A receptors. But Albert Hoffman named them psilocybin and psilocin because the genus of the mushroom is the psilocybe. So then we talk about the wide range because also not all psilocybes produce psilocybin. 95% or something of them do. Is dated back to be like 64 million years old. At least some of the gene expressions that are linked to the production of psilocybin in these and psilocin in these mushrooms and daocysteine. So uh, to me, there's no doubt that like these mushrooms have been all over the planet before humans moved all over the planet. And then if you kind of look in, I think the argument of like, oh, it has been moved from the Americas to Europe and is not super strong, mainly because like Psilocybe similanciata references, I think you can find definitely like in some of the Greek images and arts, the ancient Greek images and arts, which is the arts, which is the Liberty Cap, Psilocybe similanciata. And then, of course, you have the Egyptians like thousands of years ago. And you can also find, like, especially in the Temple of Hathor, you can find so many mushroom references. And, like, we know that Psilocybe cubensis was already growing in Africa, right? So, like, um, around those times. So, to me, it's not. I don't understand the argument that potentially Psilocybe semilanciata came from the East Coast, but then also now you see this whole uprise in Psilocybe sinensis in Europe, which I think is native to North America. Just and that is more um, because of movement and people intentionally planting them. But then you also have all the different species in Eastern Europe, like Psilocybe bohemica, which you don't find in Americas at all. So I don't think that's a strong argument that like people introduced them from Americas into Europe post Columbian contact. I think Psilocybes like naturally show up all over the world, basically all over the world where humans like to live. And then you have like local philosophies in East Asia, Central Asia, and like there's tons of these places that almost no research has been done. There's this really beautiful active map of where all the places where philosophies have been found, and Africa is dauntingly empty. And I'll bet my whole life savings that if we actually put money and energy towards that, we're gonna find maybe like probably dozens, maybe 100 new species of philosophy in the like a sub-Saharan African continent.
Wow. Do you so you said earlier that there is evidence of Psilocybe cubensis being in Africa already?
To my understanding, yes. Look, for example, at like in Algeria in the Tassili paintings, right? There's a 10,000 years ago with the mushroom faced bee shaman and then the anthropomorphized mushroom shamans, right? Like that's like full on mushroom art. And for the people that might know, back in the day, if you wanted to store mushrooms for long-term usage, just sun drying them wasn't enough. You had to store them also in honey, right? So that's like the idea of the mushroom faced bee shaman. So there was definitely like I'd be very surprised if there's no psychoactive mushrooms that inspired that art over 10,000 years ago now. Like to me, when artists, especially in those times when our ancestors had to spend a lot more resources finding food, made the time to create an art piece, it was probably for a pretty significant experience. And to make something that, even in the art styles of right now, can be considered quote unquote psychedelic art, like, of course, to me, it makes total sense, right? And like, there's actually some, I'm sure the listeners are familiar with McKenna's like stoned ape theory or hypothesis, but actually, Dr. David Nutt was part of a research that actually showed that the stimulation of the 5-HT2A receptor had potential of being connected to the explosive increase in our brain size. And this paper was released in December 2023. So that's pretty recent, right? So that's kind of like a neurochemical way of saying, oh, there was actually like some form of evolutionary foundation in McKenna's wild idea.
Wow. Okay. I've heard that the data keeps getting better around stoned ape theory hypothesis. So that's interesting. Thanks for the update on that. Do do you let's see. Let's go back and talk about Fungi Academy and how it all works there. So you're doing retreats and you're doing um, grow lessons. What else happens there?
Yeah, so we're also an intentional community. So there's on average about like a dozen, 13, 14 mycophiles living on Fungi Academy HQ in Guatemala. So we have a mushroom grow happening of mainly medicinal and gourmet mushrooms that we then extract into tinctures and sell in our local ecosystem on Lake Atitlan. And then it's also a place for people to learn about community living and share meals, do talking circles, and kind of like, yeah, really like we don't really have like a large foundation of people that like live there year round, but there's a lot of people that like come for a couple months at a time, couple weeks at a time, couple months at a time, and really dive in and create a form of community. And that often then comes with all of the challenges of community as well. Of like, oh, the community generally is a house of mirrors, right? So we often come with these stories and these bits and pieces on often our relationships with our parents, for example, and then we find that like a person within the community reflects like some of the qualities of our dad, and that kind of opens up a space to to an extent in a facilitated way um, deal with what comes up, right? So internal family systems can be a part of that, and like we have a like so that's kind of the community aspect. And then of course we have a garden, so people can help out in the garden, but we also have like a sauna and cold plunge and just kind of like the nice things in life. So a lot of people come to yeah take care of themselves, and I think a lot of people just walk away with this idea of like wow, community living and sharing a kitchen and sharing meals and not having to do everything by ourselves is can be pretty life changing and powerful. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. Um, how does Fungi Academy interact with the local community?
That's a great question, and it can be a challenge. So we are surrounded by the people of Cochical, so we're surrounded by indigenous Mayan people that still uh, wear the traditional dresses, and a lot of the people in our village they don't speak Spanish so well, so they speak Cochical or Sutuhil or Quiche or any of the other Mayan languages that are being spoken on the lake, and it's like it's a slow process. I think a lot of people think you can come in here and like, okay, just give them opportunity and everything is chill after that. But like, there's deep wounds, right? Like Guatemala, like had been in a civil war until the early 90s, and so anybody above 30, 40, that's like still remembers that and carries a lot of that with them. And um, for us, what we found works best is just finding some of the nodes within the ecosystem, some of the people, and really like helping helping out their lives, right? So being from Tomasa, who's a local oyster mushroom cultivator, she grows oyster mushrooms from corn cobs. Charlotte, she uses the cold water line pasteurization method. She used to have to travel like 2 hours one way and 2 hours back to get spawn from Shella, and now she walks 5 minutes and she gets it on credit, so she doesn't have to pay until she like had sold her mushrooms. And then even we charge her our cost price, so there's some form of exchange because also they don't want just straight up hand me outs. And now we're training her son, who was like too old to go to like school every day, but he didn't really have friends in the local town, and he was kind of getting bullied, so he was spending a lot of time inside by himself. And now we're not only training him like mushroom cultivation stuff, but we're also paying for English classes and the things that he feels inspired to cultivate within himself, right? So it's really finding these couple of nodes and really making a large impact. And it's not that we are out there. We were the first in that town. Like our town has, I think, like 150 something people from all over the world that are now calling that their home, right? So you see people having kids with indigenous folks, and you see kids being born and raised there, right? And like to to have that be more kind of what's the best word for this? But to find more union between the communities, that is not like a couple year job. That's a multi-generational job, right? And for what that means in Sununan, right? Like there's a lot, like since I got there's a lot of guys that have decided more to go to the United States. So right now you see a big a group of women being single moms because their respective partners decided to go to the United States, like a lot of people in Central America are trying to do right now. And there's a lot to that, and I'm not saying I have all the answers or I know what's best for everybody, but all I know is like we're doing our best to leave a positive impact.
Yeah, thanks for that. Is there any interest in the local people around the psychedelic aspect of the mushroom stuff?
Yeah, so we actually have like a local Superheel guy who lives with us on the terrain, and he's a Mayan rapper, and he is like he was blessed enough to be a little bit more well traveled. So he's from the lake or just the hills of the lake, but like he had a German girlfriend for a while and lived in Germany for a while, so he speaks pretty good English, and he is uh, super well inspired by that. And then there was also a pretty powerful um, timekeeper Arnac Tata Pedro Cruz, who passed away a couple of years ago, but also his son is still a wisdom carrier of the Mayan traditional um, ways and super interested in combining his traditional ritual practices, which are mainly centered around the fire, together with mushrooms, right? And then there's many, like, again, there's many different families, not directly in our like village of Tununa, but especially in Santa Lucia, there's a big family of people that didn't abide to the Christian indoctrination, which is happening, and have fought and remain to like strongly practice their indigenous belief systems. And you see with the people that practice those earth-based belief systems, and that they are very open to it. And it's like I'd also do some ethnomycological work with some of these families because like there's still some of the grandmas and grandpas that are alive that really know like a wealth of information about the mushrooms that you can find in those hills and in the forest, and they know like what to use them for, right? And that information is slowly being lost, and being able to record that is an honor and a blessing. And I'm always surprised that they know all of the psychedelic mushrooms by name as well, and like when you should take them. And like there's even before I like without me insinuating what it was, like I showed them um, the Psilocybe mexicana. That's the one that Maria Sabina preferred working with. And this old lady, she actually told me, she's like, "Oh yeah, you should eat this if you're depressed." Straight up. She just told me, and I don't know if she like how familiar she is with psychedelic literature, but like I just thought it was interesting that that's what like her ancestors told her, and it's finally taking us so much research and time to realize that that can be a cure for depression if you're working with psilocybe mushrooms.
That's fascinating, and thanks for sharing the fact that this is just part of their knowledge base. Pre Hoffman Wasson, like that's really excellent and suggestive of widespread traditions, right? And
Hmm.
not one culture owning it, right? And probably a plurality of opinions on the best way forward with it. Is it ever controversial? Like, do you ever run into um, these populations saying like the clinical stuff is scary and bad?
The clinical stuff. Oh yeah,
Right.
yeah, because like they because of the Civil War, like they are extremely untrusting of the government, um, and just like Western medicine in general. Depends on like which family you talk to, right? But like they prefer to avoid it. Like for example, like the family I'm talking about is a family of midwives, but midwifery is still illegal in Guatemala. You can't have a home birth, right? So they are very skeptical about anything that has to do with traditional Western medicine. Um, so yeah, you do see like a reluctance like to that on like the clinical side, and that's also not the way that to communicate those like that data with them, right? It's more of a like it's not the way to reach them because it's not part of their world as much.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Like, how do you meet them where they're at in a really helpful way and continue to serve them? And it's not necessarily by pushing um, contemporary psychiatry on a crowd that, and let's be real, like contemporary psychiatry isn't necessarily based on them as a population, right? It's a
Hmm.
very different group of people they research to develop psychiatry. Um,
Exactly.
yeah, um, and I do appreciate that. Like we should probably be really cautious when we're talking about this with communities like that. Go slow, for sure. That idea of people coming more and more to USA is interesting. And it sounds like some of the communities are getting fragmented as a result of people leaving.
Oh yeah.
But it's also it sounds like it's a resource thing. Like they're leaving for resources more than anything else, right?
Yeah, I think that that's often the idea, right? And like, those families of the people that left are still there, and like a common story as well. So they have to pay like quite a bit of money, like 15,000 US dollars to agree with it to get there. So the family takes on that loan or the like whatever that is from the bank. They get that straight from the bank at like like outrageous interest rates, and then they pay a coyote. But people disappear all the time, which is like in a small village of like a couple thousand people. If you hear it more than once or twice, that's crazy, you know? So people disappear, and then like the family is settled with that debt to the bank. So then actually the idea is to get more resources or not, or they don't find work because again, I mentioned to you already, like they don't really speak Spanish, so they're not even speaking Spanish. They don't speak a word of English, and then like try to make it in the United States. And I think I think it was Channel 5 who did this whole report on like the people wanting to come into the United States. And I think he said it beautifully. Like I think some of the media gaslights people to like believing that it's the best, the ultimate way. And I think resource wise, I think especially Lake Atitlan right now, there's a massive influx of resources of people that have decided to come and live there, of tourism, of spiritual tourism, of psychedelic tourism. There's like ayahuasca retreats left and right and yoga retreats left and right. Like there is resources coming in, right? And there's I think there's a immense opportunity for the people that like want to learn, but there's also a certain stubbornness, right? I think a really great example. One of my teachers and a good friend, he is a he's Quiche, and he actually got into the United States in the 90s for a speed walking visa, and he worked here completely legit legally because he was a professional speed walker and like got into the competition. So he speaks English and he does tours and he makes even for US standards quite a like good amount of money, right? So like and that's just because he loves nature, he loves mushrooms, he loves birds, and he speaks English. So people like from all over the world want like come to him to like go on tours with him. And that's just like one person that I'm aware of. So if again like if like I think the focus has to be on like tourism and how do we like create a business out of that. And like there's also local people that I know that have started stores and they started selling Palo Santo and like hippie stuff basically, and they're doing really well for themselves, right? Because people want to support the local peoples. And like it's just some of the people. And it all comes down to education, right? Like they it's harder to think of those ideas if you've not had the educational foundation to start thinking like that and out the box, right? And that's really what like when I talk to my local friends, that's what I'm trying to show them. And for us, it's very simple to say as well because there's like since especially since COVID, let's say over the last 5 years, there's been hundreds of people from especially the United States that has decided to live in Lake Atitlan. Why do you think we all want to be here? It's what I tell them, and then like you know sometimes the ball starts rolling. But it's also like if they have an older brother that went to the United States, they want to go to the United States. That's kind of like it's really family based.
Mm, yeah. And do you think there's impact? How do you think the local kind of expat community impacts that thinking? Do you think it's like positive or negative or helpful in some way?
It's hard.
Yeah.
It's like I don't think there's a clear answer of like, oh yeah, this is helpful, this is unhelpful, because I've seen both. So I think depending on who it is, I think there's like the expat community that like there's people in the expat community that really take the time to get to know the local population. And there's some people that just don't, right? And they just do their own thing, and like that that creates different relationship and different perspectives, right? Like I think to an extent they understand that we are not all equal because they have different relationships with different peoples. So I think what some people are doing has a positive impact, and what some people are doing has a negative impact.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like what Fungi Academy is doing is trying to help and support in a nice way. It sounds great. Um, yeah. So, can you tell me about like any kind of online aspects to Fungi Academy that are going on?
Yeah, so when we finished the that first round of in-person events that I did with Oliver, like he already had the idea of doing a an online course situation. And then it was March 2020, and then like, all right, we really have to do this now. Um, and the time was ripe for it. And I, by accident, like a friend of mine that I met randomly on a beach in Vietnam years before, he was also on the lake, and he is a videographer, and so kind of the stars aligned for us perfectly, and we started on Oliver's kind of magnum opus now, and his big vision of what he called the mushroom mastermind. It's like an online course that teaches people how to grow their own mushrooms all over the world, really low tech, really accessible, with lots of success. And then also like in tandem with a course that helps people that never had a psychedelic experience kind of understand the foundation of the psychedelic experience, like how to prepare, what is like physiologically going to happen with you. Um, and those two together then would like start kind of a revolution of itself, of people like learning how to relate to their own medicine, and have really profound life-changing experiences that they kind of curated themselves, because they've been part of like all bits and pieces. And the ceremony doesn't start when you eat the mushroom. The ceremony starts when you start like helping the mushroom to find life in that sense. So um, that's like was the initial wave, and we didn't have any money, and we had to like we pre-sold the courses, and we started pre-sale just the day that our electricity got cut off, so our electricity got cut off. And like after that, like we just worked our asses off for all of 2020 to get these things out. And kind of the week that we finished the psychedelic journey work course, which was later down the line, um yeah, Oliver passed away, which was like kind of a big, it was shock for everybody. It was an accident, and then like, are we gonna continue the mission? And we have continued the mission, and I'm very happy to say 3.5 years still later, we're still here in his honor. And we we've kind of been focusing more on the like in-person events for a lot longer. But last year we created a fungal ecology course because I felt called that now there's this we're fully in the psychedelic renaissance, and there's a lot of people that are really interested in mushrooms, and mushroom swag is becoming so popular. And then maybe people like Fantastic Fungi came out, and maybe people know kind of what a mycorrhiza is, but like not really on the fundamental level. So that was our intention. And um, we've been doing these mushroom master classes with like amazing speakers from all over the world, from all over the field, and really like fusing the fields of like full on hardcore mycology to super psychedelics, and everything in between is something that we like to have more knowledge of out there. And that accumulated to a summit, and we had Dennis McKenna speak, and we've had like the blessing of, yeah, amazing group of facilitators and teachers sharing their knowledge. And yeah, that's kind of like the online aspect. We're kind of reinventing that, and we're probably like right now, like I'm really interested in like the cohort online course idea again, and like really going through a trajectory for several weeks with a group of people, and kind of creating more online community like that. So there's a lot more to come, but that's kind of what's been happening. And in the meanwhile, we always offer free online integration circles. We were offering free mushroom cultivation Q&A sessions for a while, and we're going to pick that back up again. And there's like really making Fungi Academy one of the platforms where people can come to learn about mycology and psychedelics, and like sacred mushrooms and all the good stuff. I have a whole list of online courses that I want to keep making, but it's we've worked our asses off for 5 years straight, and now some of our team members are getting babies, and we're taking it a little bit slower. as of right now, but there's ideas for decades to come, I feel like.
So, where are you seeing people come from around the world? And like, do you think it's having an impact back in their home countries?
I know it's having an impact. So we have had in person, we've had um, students from over 40 countries, online 100 something countries, thousands of students. I got messages from people that's like started with the online course and started full on mushroom like cultivation operations, right? So that's already a change. And like people that like didn't weren't able to purchase like lion's mane in their town are now able to buy lion's mane of the food market of somebody that learned how to grow lion's mane and the foundations of mushroom cultivation through one of our programs or courses, right? So like I definitely I've definitely seen that, and I've seen people start like intentional community like projects, and just like the hundreds, if not thousands, of people now that have gone through Fungi Academy HQ, like just when I glimpse in those lives, like it has affected people like profoundly, and that's kind of why we want to keep doing what we're doing, right? Like it's yeah, the mushroom wisdom, the mushroom knowledge, and there's also that kind of this alternative way of living idea that like really like hits people in a really beautiful way. So yeah, like people have gone into like psychedelic facilitation like careers. People started mushroom farms, other psychedelic oriented businesses. Like it's kind of like a whole field of mushrooms popping left and right, and from what they've gathered and accumulated and learned from Fungi Academy in the virtual or in the physical space. So it's really really motivating, and it's yeah, it makes me really excited that like it is having a direct impact.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's a big deal. Like this community thing, we
Hmm.
often talk about in the psychedelic space community as medicine or community as healing. And that can be sometimes more powerful and impactful for people than psychedelics themselves, which we think are pretty impactful as well. But being with people, being seen, being able to cooperate in a way that's more natural for us as a species, I think is really important and helpful. So I'm glad you're doing that and modeling that and it's spreading and people understanding ecosystems better. It sounds like there's some permaculture philosophy and techniques mixed in which, with your education, which I think is super valuable. Could you talk about that a little bit?
The permaculture aspect, I
Yeah, and how you include that in your work?
yeah. So I've never taken a formal permaculture class. I've actually, since I've been teaching so much in the last 5 years and learning, I've been feeling called to like learn and like be the student again for a little bit more. And like a formal permaculture class is probably one of the first things I'd really like to take. But like I'm blessed enough to have really amazing permaculture teachers as my neighbor. Right? There's Atitlan Organics and Gran Atzikin, Neil, Shad and Neil. They're like, in my opinion, class permaculture facilitators. So those lessons kind of seep through, and then of course we have permaculture practitioners pass through. So kind of like ideas of like basically doing a lot of the work up front, so you have to do work less, but also like making sure you like stack functions, I think is a really beautiful like aspect of permaculture philosophy, right? So often we think of doing things in isolation, but like that's kind of like an archaic way of doing it, and that's also not how fungi do it, right? So fungi, like take mycorrhiza, really brief. There's a fungi that connect to the roots of plants, but lots of them are also partially saprotrophic, meaning that they also digest dead stuff within an ecosystem. So they connect to the roots of plants. They create that wood wide web that people probably know of, right? They trade nutrients between different organisms, and they share water with the plants, and then they get sugar in the form of carbon in return. But also that mycelium around the roots is slowly digesting that substrate, that earth, and absorbing what is happening around the roots, but it's also making those nutrients more accessible for the root hairs of the plant that are still exposed, right? So there's so many layers of things that are happening in this mycorrhizal connection. It's not just like a super highway for information and food. It's a complex system, and like how we emulate that with Fungi Academy, right? Like I think maybe some people have seen our YouTube videos, but like when we make one, we can also make a short. That's a very simple aspect. But then also that can be turned into a blog, or the blog can be turned into a YouTube video, and really like finding the ways to share as much information from a same root of work, right? Be it like a podcast recording or an online class that we did or whatever, and spreading that to different places. And I think that the same works with that to me is a permaculture practice that we can apply to many different things in life, right? And if we like approach like just generally anything from, okay, how can we make this more sustainable? How can we make this long lasting? And how can we make it so that if we do a lot of work right now, we have to do less work in the future? And work can be play, super fun, but like copy pasting the same stuff in a Excel sheet when you can spend a day setting it up that it like the Excel sheet, for example, fills out automatically. That is a way more valuable like spending of our time. So yeah, like that's kind of the ways that I get from permaculture, and also kind of like observing, right? Like looking at something first before immediately starting acting. Like, okay, before you start to build a ditch or like a channel for where the water can go. Okay, try to observe what the land is doing so you can see where the water flows most naturally. And I think in our culture, we're just generally like, okay, just start doing it and we'll figure it out later, right? Like that kind of that startup approach of like move fast, break things. Like it's not always sustainable because then you're just bashing your head against the wall at one point.
Right. It can feel like that for sure. Um, yeah, there's so much wisdom, I think, for the psychedelic community as well from the permaculture movement. And I really, as soon as I took my PDC ages ago, I was really hopeful that we could get it more included in public school curriculums, because I think it's um, just a really foundational way to see the world and perhaps what kinds of work we need to do in the world, right? Yeah, succession planting and rotational grazing and all these things. And it's not just about gardening, right? It's about how to see energy flow through systems and perhaps like make best use of it all. And um, yeah, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful. I also hope that someday we can also do some psychedelic and permaculture PDCs. Might need to be longer than 14 days, but
Hmm.
I think that would be really good.
Yeah, and you mean like integrating psychedelics with permaculture, or just like kind of psychedelic lessons and like permaculture, or like like permaculture for psychonauts, and like being able to reflect, like spend a little bit more time on like how do you represent this in your community?
Right. So I would want to introduce the concept for a while, and then I would want to perhaps have some retreats. So in the retreats, would have psychedelic experience alongside the PDC education. The PDC education can be harrowing for people. I don't want to mince words about it. It's a big deal because a lot of your foundations for your worldview are going to crumble tragically. And same thing with psychedelics. So we'd want to be a little gentle, probably with the psychedelic dosing. That's how I would think about it, and perhaps similarly figure out how to be gentle with the psychedelic education,
Hmm.
because that can similarly be quite harrowing for people.
Have you found that to be more effective as you grow, like as we age every year, that like the gentle approach to psychedelics is sometimes overlooked?
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure. It's like a miracle grow versus like a longer slow period with a more organic fertilizer of some kind, like a fish emulsion or whatever. And yeah, there's some people for which a big experience is really helpful and necessary, and then there's people who require like a lot slower of a process, depending on how much trauma they're carrying. Um, yeah. Do you see that at all?
Yeah, like especially me personally, like I find that gentle reminders now and then have a lot more impact than, I've already been to those whoa experiences, right? And sometimes I feel like, okay, well, it's harder for me to take stuff back personally. And, we, um, during our cultivation courses as well, we don't fully advertise this, but like, uh, generally we also like do what we call celebration ceremony. And the intention is not to go and deep and we're going to deal with all of our deepest traumas now, but like, hey, we all learned how to grow these organisms together, and like we spend like more than a week building community, and like that's all like an intentional way of celebrating can also be a part of that. And people we don't give people a lot, like a gram and a half max, maybe two generally, and people have incredibly profound experiences. So
Yeah.
like I don't think like I think it's the same with this whole debate, and maybe we can talk about this as well because I have some strong opinions about this. This whole idea that more is better, right? Stronger mushrooms is better, and like I don't necessarily think that's the case. And I think and maybe it's my European arrogance, or like my view of the United States, that like I look at people in the United States and like, oh, we have to make the cannabis as strong as possible. Oh, we have to make these mushrooms as strong as possible. Like I do remember when mushrooms were still in the store in the Netherlands, and the only names they had were like Colombian, uh, Mexican. It's just the strain name was the original place where this species, like this strain, this cultivar Psilocybe cubensis was found. And then like cultivators in North America went absolutely like ham shit and started making Jedi mindfuck and enigmas and like these new tidal waves, and often focusing on like higher potency.
So I was thinking about this a lot lately, and it finally struck me that this is a function of the drug war, and perhaps it would have happened another way if the incentives were different. But I think there was a trend in the UK for a while. It might be in the continent of Europe as well, where they would make ecstasy pills really, really strong, where you're supposed to cut them up four ways sometimes. And if you ate the whole thing, you might end up in the hospital. In fact, there's a good chance you might really need it. And I think it's called the iron law of prohibition, where as the stigma and penalties go up, the potency goes down. There's economic incentives to mail less actual material. And I think that's what's happening. I think some people are just figuring out also potency and genetic manipulation, so they're getting excited about it from a technical point of view. But I think you're onto something. It's not necessarily the right move. Especially these things don't really come with labels. You're like, this one's 85%, this one's 2%, and like a gram is no longer a gram. Hasn't
Yeah,
been for a little bit now.
yeah. And but I think it's interesting to also go back on your ecstasy debate, right? Like I don't know if you know, but Netherlands is like by far the biggest producer of MDMA in the world. So like I grew up with five euro grams of pure MDMA. I had the luxury of,
€5 gram.
oh yeah, oh yeah, for sure, 100%. That's cheaper than drinking.
Oh my god.
Yeah. So the pills were getting stronger. I do remember that because when I started, they were like 100 milligrams, and then by the end time I was kind of done with pressed pills. They were like 250. And then there's a lot of stigma around like, oh, there's all this other stuff in it. But in the Netherlands, it's also legal to test. So I was always interested, what's in this stuff, right? And I send it, and you get like a whole beautiful like relay of what binders and it's all free. You just lose the pill, but then again, the pill is like $1 or something. So it's like, it's pretty chill in that sense. But I only personally ever find a lot of caffeine and MDMA. But then there's always this idea that there's more speed or amphetamines, other amphetamines in the pill itself. To go back on the mushroom situation, right? Like we will also have to talk about like the health of the organism, right? Because if you look at an enigma, that would never survive in the wild. That is not a vibrant, strong, healthy organism, right? It's kind of a weird mutation, and to me, it's kind of
Yeah.
like eating like let's say you want to make chicken dinner, and you get two choices of a chicken: a big chicken that has way more fat and but has like four necks and there's like tongues coming out of the shoulders. It looks gross, but you get more You get more of what you want, like ex want, quote unquote, or just a healthy, normal looking chicken that is a little smaller and has maybe
Yeah.
less nice breast meat, but like it is definitely more healthy looking. Which one do you want, right? And like nobody is talking about that, but like we disconnect from the organism and the molecule, right? Like we need more psilocybin. Psilocybin is the molecule, but we forget that there's actually a and it's a unique, very special organism, these mushrooms, that have a whole chemical cocktail of other constituents that are not being tested for, right? What about baeocystin? What about like agurenescin that we don't know enough about right now? What about these other molecules, potential tryptamines that like have hardly been studied that are definitely present? I don't know if they're present in psilocybe cubensis, but I would be surprised if there's not some crazy, like sort of like chemical golden grill hiding behind the powerful alchemist of the psilocybe mushrooms.
Yeah, agreed. That's there's a lot left to study here. I've certainly been experimenting with psilocin directly. It's interesting. It's different, but it's interesting. Um, but the other molecules, they we really need to dig into what else is going on in there. There's You might be happy to know that there's some of these kind of pharma companies that are actually trying to do whole mushroom research.
Oh, amazing.
So I think that's a development that's really helpful. Um, I think even Numinous ages ago had something like this, and there's other companies as well, in partnership with groups like Ohio State University, which is nice to see.
Yeah, and it's just the beginning of that, right? And I just hope that we can
Yeah,
then like my goal is always that like we stop referring to them as psilocybin mushrooms for and just call them back like I prefer back to magic mushrooms because like they can be magic, right? Just because it's I think it loses a connection that it's an organism if you're just like hyper focused and like it's such a reductionist way of looking at something if we just look at that one molecule. That's just my
right.
personal approach, right? So and then we just call them like psilocybes and you know right now it's also when we talk about that most people just only had psilocybe cubensis, but I'm a big fan of all of the other exotic psilocybes and I think they have different characters and um, different traits and like I don't know how much they're active they're down, but like I remember talking to Field Trip back in the day when they were in Jamaica and they were noticing that like psilocybe stimulantiata, which is generally higher in baeocystin, for them in their therapy practices, was leading to less people have the challenging experiences. So like much like their argument was like, oh, what we're seeing is that higher concentration of baeocystin in the mushroom is actually more quote unquote gentle for the patient. And this is I don't know how many people they tested. I just talked to this one guy. This is what he shared. I didn't see any other data. I've never seen any other data on this. But that would be very interesting to test out, right? So again, like the whole, and then we saw this as well. I don't know if you saw that study. It was also relatively recent, but they they gave patients synthesized psilocybin, and then they gave patients the hot water extract of psilocybe cubensis mushroom, so tea. And the group that had the tea generally had a more positive impact from their therapy sessions with the psychedelic. And they attributed this to the entourage effect, right? So basically saying that like by consuming the organism and their molecules in a as an and alkaloids in a whole, there was a more positive effect for the patient instead of working with a extracted or synthesized pure psilocybin molecule.
Yeah. I did see that one. It was interesting because that was the first real signal that I saw, that there is a difference. And I think obviously we need to do a lot more research, but I think we could say that about almost everything.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I see a lot of stuff just get like really um, glossed over in science and details wise specifically. It's
Yeah,
like
for
this is
sure.
better than that. It's like, well, is it really that easy to say that about almost anything? you know, there's a lot there.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I think Jasper, it's time to wrap. Anything else you want to kind of mention coming up at Fungi Academy?
Yeah, so we just opened up enrollments for upcoming course season. So enrollments for like October class. We have a class happening in December. No, December something else. January and March. They generally tend to sell out. And so if you're interested in coming down to Guatemala, learning how to grow your own mushrooms, medicine, learn something about community life. In October, we're also taking Reggie that I talked about earlier, and we're going on a whole day Mayan mushroom foraging excursion. So it's all in all a good time, and like you learn how to grow all kinds of mushrooms all over the world.
That's amazing. I love that. All right, Jasper. Well, thank you for your time. Thanks for sharing all this stuff with us, and I hope we can do more.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for having me on. Thanks for listening,
Absolutely.
everybody.